plant protection. Yes, that's right. It's still very early in the year, and what you might find is that you're putting lots of plants in that aren't going to withstand a very cold night temperature or a frost. The best thing you can do is quickly monitor your weather forecast and see what the nighttime temperatures are. In the south of England, generally anything below 6 degrees, I would be protecting my plants outside. Greenhouse plants, like in the greenhouse here, I would be making sure that my greenhouse heater is working to keep it above 8 degrees. So let's have a look at a few plants that may or may not need protection. So first off, I've got a well-established chive plant there, and this would be fine outside in a frost. What you might find is that some of the tips will get damaged, but it's not a biggie. You can always trim that, so that's fine. Something like that that's been hardened off, that's been outside a couple of hours each day, if it's been grown in a greenhouse or something like that, and then it's been planted out in a bed or a pot for a while, that will be fine. The same goes for things like primulas in the spring. So this is a little primrose, that would be absolutely fine. But still, I would consider maybe using something like a piece of horticultural fleece here. This is a very thin fleece. What I would say with that is that just get the thickest you can, because it will add more protection. But you can just wrap small pots like that, or if it's in a larger planting, just get it round the planting and just use some clothes pegs just to peg it together, or weigh it down with something. Although the plant will withstand the frost, what you're doing is protecting the blooms. But what you do want to do is to make sure after the temperature has risen a bit in the morning, you're taking that fleece off again, so that they're not sitting below a potentially soggy fleece. So that's those. What else have we got? Well, this is actually a bedding plant that I overwintered. This is a pelargonium, a zonal geranium. And what's quite common is that you can actually buy online and in garden centres, nurseries, you can buy these now ready to go, garden ready, so ready to go in the garden. They're usually a smaller plant, and people will pop them into pots or into borders at this time of year, so end of March, beginning of April, and think, yeah, that's great, they're in the garden centre, they must be fine to go out. But the garden centres at night are wrapping them up in this stuff if they're not under cover. So you need to really consider that, and you need to think, I need to use probably, well, if it was something like this, you'd need to use a couple of layers, but really they shouldn't be going out into the garden until, I would say, end of May, beginning of June. It will depend on where you are. For instance, in the southeast of England, we could probably get away with a lot earlier. What you really need to do is monitor your weather forecast. Also, I'll share a link to check your average frost date, and that will give you the dates that are typically between the last frost you will get in your area. For instance, for us, we're actually down here in the southeast England, it's the 28th of March today, and we're past our average frost date. But I've had a look at the weather forecast, and the weather forecast next week, the temperature's down to 2 degrees, maybe less, overnight. So that's real frost territory and cold territory, and could potentially kill or severely damage your plants. So with your tender bedding plants, your annual bedding plants, unless they're like I said, typical winter bedding, like your primulas that have been hardened off, they need to stay in the greenhouse. Sorry. Also, something which might be planted out in the garden already, this is a greenhouse grown one which I've been holding off as long as I can to plant it out. This is a broad bean, okay, and this broad bean, as soon as I plant it out, will be, you know, I'll harden it off, put them out for a few hours each day, and then they're good they're good to be planted in the garden. And in fact, you can direct sow them into the garden. The problem is when you get a frost, although the plant will probably survive, it will blacken all the tip there. It will damage the tip, the frost, or an extreme cold weather. So you need to protect these somehow. And the easiest way to protect something like this, particularly if it's sort of almost, what I would do is not train this up something straight away. I would have it perhaps resting in that area, and I would get a old drinks bottle like that. Again, you can use your fleece, but something like this is nice and simple, where you're planting in individually spaced plants, and you're just cutting off the bottom bit of the pot, taking off this outer wrapper here, take the lid off. You need a bit of airflow in there. You don't want to then create a mildew problem, and with the frost it will be fine with just that little hole there. But if you're worried, you can pop these on overnight, and then that's there will go over your plant, okay, and protect your plant. Now bear in mind, it's going to outgrow this particular size very quickly, but if you can imagine, that's just sitting just enough in the ground to anchor it down, and then the plant is within the bottle there. What I'll probably use for these broad beans is a larger bottle. I'll use a big 2-litre drinks bottle. But that's a simple way to protect things like broad beans, peas that you might have planted out early, which will probably survive, but they will blacken and get damaged. Other options, well, these I more commonly use in the greenhouse to protect plants, but you've got your little propagator lids. And if you've direct sown seed into plant beds or pots and you want to protect them somehow, and you feel it needs a bit more than fleece, you can use something like that if the dimensions work for you. Also, you can get, you know, simpler ones like these without the vents. Or again, this was a large drinks container, I think it was a 5-litre one, that was just cut, and then that can be buried in the soil just to protect it. So if I grab a tray here, so you imagine that's your soil level, you can just anchor it in there and protect your plants and your seedlings. Now let's quickly go into the garden to look at one or two other things. So here I am in my garden in a little raised bed, and say I've got a little seedling that I want to protect, or I've got a plant which is perfectly hardy in a pot, like these pansies here that have been out all winter. You can tell because they're getting a bit leggy and tatty, and I just want to keep the blooms nice. I can place them on the ground like that, and just like the little propagator lids I showed you, you've got a cloche here, which is, this one's a plastic one, you can get them in all sorts, and this actually has a vent on the side, and that just protects whatever's under it there, gives it that extra few degrees warmth. The trick with these is after the temperature increases, like all the other protection during the morning, is to get these lifted off for airflow. So over this side again, you'll see our cloches, you'll see our propagator lid which is weighed down with a piece of wood, you'll see our horticultural fleece, and that is pegged to the pot, everything bunched up, pegged to the pot. That's using a workshop clip, but close pegs work brilliant. And then on the actual beds here, I've got two examples. If you weren't using horticultural fleece, you could just use something like tarpauling, and this is quite a effective, like sort of emergency measure for getting late in the spring or early in the autumn, where plants aren't quite hard enough to take it. You can just carefully have it braced over a bed, making sure it's not touching any of the plants, just weigh it down, and it'll just give that few degrees of heat that they'll need, that protection from the cold air. This is a piece of landscape fabric on this side, so you can just use any fabric. One other option, is that if you've been planting stuff, you probably have some compost bags lying around. This is quite an old compost bag I've got, and you can just put that over the top of a pot as it is. A few little air holes in it might not go amiss, just for airflow, and or you can cut it up and use it as a fabric, just like we have here. Okay, let's look at some other options. Here's a large fleece bag. Here's a fleece polytunnel, open-ended. You can also close up the ends. You can use a plastic polytunnel style. You can use your fabric like we've discussed, fleece fabric weighed down with bricks over a bed. Fleece covering the top of tender plants like this tree fern. You can use a thicker fabric. This is a plant protection bag. Again, you can use your fleece wrapped around tender exotics like this. You can create a structure with a frame and then make your fleece frame. You can make these cold frames or buy them pre-made. This is a polycarbonate one. And here's a different type of cloche. This is a bell cloche. Also, you can use bubble wrap. Just wrap that around your plant or your pot. I also use it to protect the inside of my greenhouse. It gives me an extra few degrees. And here I've got a hessian bag which I've used to protect the pot also. It's worth if you've got these terracotta pots doing that. Thank you. If you like this video, please like and subscribe.